From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Let me introduce you immediately James Billington, the librarian of the Library of Congress. Thank you, Mrs. Billington.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ambassador Terzi, Justice Scalia, Senator Pera, members of the academic and legislative communities, and distinguished guests all. We are really honored to have you join us today for what is really going to be an exciting element of intercultural dialogue and the establishment, and I think absolutely fascinating addition to our own history that is represented by the Italian Enlightenment. I'm pleased to welcome you here to the Library of Congress for the discussion of the Italian Enlightenment and the American Constitution. The library, I think, is a very fitting venue in which to celebrate Gaetano Filangieri, an important figure of the Italian Enlightenment in Naples. He picked a nice location, and Benjamin Franklin, an American founding father, whom we like to claim in Philadelphia, which is my native town, even though they're not faring very well in the current postseason baseball. The library not only holds the papers of Benjamin Franklin, many of his contemporaries, but Italian items numbering well over 500,000 volumes. And I was happy to learn that the researcher from the Italian embassy was able to find the relevant materials, it even says all the relevant materials, here needed to prepare the study of these two statesmen, which will be published in Italy. On both sides of the Atlantic, during the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas, the role of reason, the effort to improve society, influenced greatly the drafting of the Constitution, independence movements, and nation building. The Neapolitan Enlightenment reflected in Filangieri, the author of a masterpiece of legislative reform, The Science of Legislation, surely ranks with Vico, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, and many others who influenced the fields of law, economics, and governmental administration. I think it's kind of fascinating that our founding fathers were both students of the contemporary European Enlightenment, and we're finding many more Swiss, Italian, Dutch contributors, intellectual contributors to what was really the great flower of enlightenment in Europe, of which we are the lucky inheritors. But also the founding fathers were students of antiquity. And once again, Italy, the shape of Rome and Greece, but really mainly the history of Rome was also something which they discussed and argued, just as they did the ideas of the contemporary Enlightenment. So there was a kind of a double influence, Italian influence, that we can celebrate, acknowledge today as the study of our own formation and history acquires a much richer mix of not only founding fathers, but founding uncles and aunts, you might say. Anyhow, corresponding with Filangieri over a period of years, Franklin, an author, inventor, diplomat, and scientist, was a leading American man of ideas and statesman, and those two things were often combined during the Age of Reason. Next door, you will find a small exhibition of the writings of Filangieri and Franklin, as well as a map from the period. There's much more to be mined and learned, but this is the beginning, and it's wonderful to see such a great group here gathered for this fine occasion. So I want to thank Ambassador Terzi and the Embassy of Italy for planning this important conference. It will be recorded and mounted on the library's website and an important addition to our archives. So once again, welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you for enriching the dialogue between our two countries, which have been so enriched by Italians, Italian culture, and the great legacy, the multiple legacies, one might say, of Italian culture. So something we hope to celebrate on this, even more on this World Digital Library that we're building with UNESCO over the next few years. So once again, thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Library of Congress. If the blinds were open, you would see the Capitol out of this window and the Supreme Court out of this window. This is the little corner, the unique corner in Washington that shapes them both. Both, we feel, whose constitutional duties and whose constitution happily reflect this enlightened influence that we celebrate today. We thank you all very much for being here. Look forward to our continuing dialogue and to gatherings such as this. Once again, welcome, thank you, and we wish you a very happy, and we thank the Embassy of Italy for putting on this extraordinary meeting and enrichment of our own sense of who we are, where we've come from. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Billington. I'm pleased to introduce to you the Ambassador of Italy, Giulio Terzi di Sant'Agata.
Thank you very much, Justice Sinisi, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Special thanks to Justice Sinisi for having been not only the mastermind, but also the author of this so important research concerning the correspondence between Gaetano Filangieri and Benjamin Franklin. And it is even more significant for us to go into this subject in this very special venue, which is the Library of Congress. It is a venue where over the last few months only, we have had the opportunity of seeing the exposition on two different occasions of important masterpieces of Italian library, and we have already felt the friendship and the warmth of the chief librarian and of the whole Library of Congress and Congress itself. So it's particularly significant to be here to talk about Filangieri and Benjamin Franklin, their friendship and their intellectual partnership. This conference is included in the program of celebration for the 150th anniversary of the unification of Italy, a celebration which here in the United States is developing an ambitious program which is under the auspices of the President of the Republic of Italy, the Honorable Giorgio Napolitano. It is also an extraordinary opportunity to rediscover the deep cultural roots of the relations between Italy and the United States and the many points of contact which join the Italian Risorgimento and the defining of Americans' own national identity. Last February, we proposed the idea of a possible collaboration with the library in view of the 150th anniversary of the unification of Italy. And it was thanks to the enthusiasm and the scientific curiosity of Dr. James Billington and Dr. John Markham that we were witnessing the driving force which did the rest on their part. Thank you, Honorable Billington and Dr. Markham, for planting the seeds of such a successful cooperation. The results exceed, indeed, every expectation and have developed a very original and complete research focusing on the correspondence between Filangieri, a young and visionary follower of the Enlightenment of the late 18th century, and the more mature founding father of the United States, Benjamin Franklin, a man of immense talent. The meeting of ideas between Filangieri's concept of a universal constitution for a modern state and the powerful strength of ideas of a new federal nation, the United States, was the veritable meeting between dream and reality. It contributed to the spreading of the American dream in Europe. And today, we uncover events which history's sediment had obscured and bring them back to light. Indeed, we are confident that they will arouse a new curiosity and attention in those who are keen scholars of this era. We are honored by the participation to this conference of two prominent scholars and intellectuals. They give enormous relevance and strength to our project, or to this research on Filangieri and Franklin. Senator Pera, formerly President of the Senate of the Republic of Italy, a renowned scholar, an accomplished philosopher, and a very leading expert on Austrian thinker Karl Popper. He is, behind many other things, a university professor, a fellow of some of the most prestigious American and British institutions and universities, a refined politician and an author of political essays which have deeply influenced the political thinking as well as the cultural debate in Europe and worldwide. Senator Pera has called into question what he called cultural relativism. It is an approach which he developed with future Pope Benedict XVI, then Cardinal Ratzinger, in the pivotal analysis entitled Without Rules. Politics and philosophy are at the heart of Filangieri's work, who envisioned a new political system serving mankind. Let me warmly thank Justice Anthony Scalia. His background is deeply rooted in Italian and classical culture. We are honored by his presence. As a speaker, we will admire through his presentation the great jurist, the renowned expert of the Constitution of the United States, and his defense of the original thought of the Founding Fathers. Justice Scalia's upbringing was influenced, as I said, by Italian culture and philosophy, as his father, Salvatore Eugenio Scalia, a professor of Romance languages at Brooklyn College, taught him to read and speak French. We hope that the publication of the research that is presented today will soon be possible also thanks to the foreseen contribution of the National Italian-American Bar Association, here represented through its president, Anthony Gianfrancesco. We expect that the collaboration with the Library of Congress may also give new impetus to the Filangieri Museum in Naples, which contains extremely valuable historical and bibliographical presentation on Franklin's works and other treasures, yet to be catalogued and to be made available to today's historians and scholars. We are working on bringing some of these invaluable rarities to the United States and to make them available to the public and to researchers. Thank to all of you, to our speakers, to the organizers, and thank to this wonderful audience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ambassador Terzi. Let me introduce to you the Senator Pera. His point of view, or the philosophy of that time, should be for us a big gift. Today is for us, with us after a summer of studies that I requested to him, and I hope he's not angry with me because of my request. So, thank you for coming, Senator Pera.
Well, thank you. And first of all, congratulations to James Billington and the Library of Congress and Giannicola Sinisi and the Italian Embassy for the organization of this meeting, for the splendid job they have done. Thank you also for the nice words our ambassador has spent about me. I will tell them to my wife, but I'm sure that she won't trust me. So I thank you very much. And also thanks Giannicola Sinisi. And secondly, thank you for being here, so many people, and also for inviting me. And as far as I can see, I mean, Justice Scalia is the right person in the right place at the right moment, but as for myself, the only justification I can produce or adduce is that I'm Italian, like Filangieri. I'm a philosopher, like Filangieri. I'm an admirer of America, like Filangieri. But that doesn't imply that I played a role in the drafting of the American Constitution, unfortunately. So I've chosen, as a philosopher, to discuss with you a philosophical question to which both Filangieri and Franklin devoted much energy. And it is the question of human rights and the liberal and democratic state which is founded upon them. So Filangieri's starting point in his Science of Legislation, 1780, was, when can a law be said to be a good law? So this is a question philosophers like to raise and politicians like to dismiss, but it's an important question. And Filangieri's answer was, there are two kinds of goodness. One is the absolute goodness and the relative goodness. So a law is absolutely good if it is in agreement, I'm quoting from Filangieri, in agreement with the universal principles of morality common to all nations and all governments. And the law is relatively good if it agrees with the historical, environmental, cultural, religious, and so on and so forth, circumstances of the people whom it addresses. So in short, a law is relatively good if it reflects the state of the nation which receives it. And this means that if a law is not absolutely good, then that law is illegitimate. You would say in modern terms, is against the Constitution, so it has to be cancelled. But if it is not relatively good, that law is not useful, and perhaps it is harmful. Now, Filangieri was not a political scientist in the strict sense, the professional sense of the word. Like Machiavelli before him, but without his moral unscrupulousness, he intended to advance a philosophy in aid of governments. But in order for his philosophy to aid governments, he had to solve two preliminary questions. First, what are the principles of absolute goodness rulers should abide by? What are they? And the second preliminary question is, how can the principles of absolute goodness be known? So Filangieri's answer to the first question is the same as that of the natural right tradition as passed down by John Locke and the drafters of the United States Declaration of Independence. So in brief, Filangieri makes the two following statements. First, there are universal moral principles. Quote, natural right contains the immutable principles of eternal justice in every case, unquote. And the second statement, these principles have a divine origin. As Filangieri remarks, quote, they are neither the result of the ambiguous maxims of the moralist, nor, this is the probably reference to Machiavelli, nor the useless or unproductive meditations of a philosopher. They are the dictates of universal reason, and of that moral code which the author of nature has imprinted on the heart of every individual of the human race. So Filangieri answered to the second question, how can the principles, or the absolute principles of good laws be known? He's also indebted to the same tradition stemming from John Locke, because he makes two further statements. First, the universal moral principles of absolute goodness are understandable by everyone according to his own reason. Quote, the savage of Nova Zambia is aware, as well as Locke, that he has not the right to the beast killed at a distance in the chase by one of his tribe. And the other statement, the universal moral principles are knowable through revelation. Besides reason, Filangieri writes, quote, the next object of absolute goodness is revelation. The laws should neither endeavor to oppose its progress nor weaken its effect. An attempt at either would be an attempt to shake the foundations of an edifice raised by the great being, who has the right or the first right to our obedience. So there are two consequences, in my view, that can be drawn from this, especially from this latter statement. The first consequence is historical. And in my view, it should be kept in mind by European leaders and intellectuals, especially when they speak about the European political unification, European identity, and the so-called European Constitution. And the point is this: if the universal moral principles of absolute goodness are directly or indirectly bound to revelation, that is to say, Christian revelation, then it can be affirmed that without Christianity, there would be no Europe. And the second consequence is more philosophical than historical and concerns religion's moral and political function. If, as Filangieri wrote, religion is an expansion and modification of universal principles of morality, then we can say that without a religion, and in particular without Christianity, human rights have no grounding. That's what Filangieri writes. Revelation should be the legislator's guide. The Decalogue alone contains within a few precepts everything to be collected from 100 volumes of morality. The private peace of individuals and families, conjugal virtue, public tranquility are the necessary consequences of what inestimable advantage to legislators is not such a perfect model. This is not to say that for Filangieri the state must be confessional. In his view, there is a clear distinction between law and the personal morality of the people. The state attends to the former, individuals' thoughts, intentions, and what now today we call lifestyles, must not be the legislator's concern. But on the other hand, the state can reach on its goal of ensuring the serenity and security of its citizens if their private lives are not inspired by virtue. This is what Filangieri writes again. The citizens' public order and security required that authority stop before his doorstep, that it respect the citizens' peace and liberty, it will allow due course to his desires. At the same time, they require further restraint, another tribunal, judge, code of conduct regulating the citizens' hidden actions, curbing his secret abundance, encouraging his undisclosed virtues, binding him to justice, honesty, and virtue. Here is religion through action, end quote. And this is clearly one point of contact between Filangieri, Franklin, and the founding fathers of America. But this is also my concern. Because today, a growing number of intellectuals, as well as politicians and judges at times, believe that religion is an obstacle to the peaceful coexistence of people of different nations. And it ought to be kept separate from political life, and that it cannot belong to the public sphere. While Filangieri and the American founders thought that free institutions and liberal regimes need a moral and a religious basis, today philosophers claim instead that liberalism or democracy is freestanding. That is to say, it is simply political with no foundation apart from our constitutional agreements. And I do believe that this view is not only wrong, it is also risky, because it jeopardizes our Western culture and civilization. Allow me to briefly to say why. Human rights, according to Filangieri, are innate, universal, sacred, imprescriptible. These are his expressions. As such, they are prior to the state and independent of it. People enjoy human rights, quo persons, not co-citizens. As Locke maintained, human rights exist even in the state of nature. Now, this idea implies that the state cannot be entirely neutral with respect to the different life visions, nor entirely independent in regard to the different religions. More precisely, the idea of a divine origin of human rights implies that the liberal and democratic state is indebted to the morality and religion that engenders and nurtures the culture of those rights. That is, that it is indebted to Christianity and to every moral comprehensive doctrine that takes inspiration from Christianity. And here a paradox arises. Because on the one side, the liberal state is a secular state. It requires a separation between church and state, and between politics and religion. But on the other side, the liberal state, precisely because the human rights it protects stem from God, and they are known through revelation, requires a religious grounding. Is there a way out of this conundrum? Well, philosophically, this is a source of an ongoing debate, and I don't enter into it here. But what I can say is that historically, the way out of the conundrum has been found, and the problem apparently has been solved. Since the Enlightenment, modern political culture has triggered what we may term the process of detachment or emancipation. That is to say, that culture has detached the liberal state and human rights from religion and has emancipated political reason from all religious morality. The move seems reasonable, because the detachment of free institutions from moral codes or religious tradition promises to bring more tolerance and more hospitality within our states. Nevertheless, the result is not satisfactory. Not only has tolerance not increased in our countries, and the issue of citizenship very often become controversial, the very nature of human rights has deeply changed. Once insurmountable limits to the action of the state, they are now becoming political and therefore contingent and partisan decisions of governments. Human rights are put to votes. And this is a dramatic turning point, and we ought to reflect upon it. If human rights depends on political decisions, can we claim we are becoming more free? Our forefathers fought to be free from the tyranny of absolutist and theocratic regimes. Are we not perhaps plunging into another absolute regime and another theocracy, a democratic absolutism, or a secular theocracy, if I may call them so? This is a risk. This is my concern. I don't think it's also is the worst one. There is another one. Nowadays, the explosion of human rights claims increasingly depends on international bodies, courts of justice, and Supreme Courts, rather than national parliaments. In particular, the judiciary. Once a passive body, as in Filangieri's conception, is now turning creative. It creates law. And this gives rise to another serious problem, because the highest virtue of the judicial system, that is its independence, is in danger of becoming its greatest weakness, that is its assimilation to a political body. To conclude, Filangieri and Franklin taught us that human rights require free institutions, that free institutions require deep moral virtues and strong religious commitments. As a European who has seen what catastrophes happen to a continent when it denies its own religious roots, I'm very much concerned about how things are going today. As an admirer of America, I leave to my audience the burden of comforting me. Thank you.
Senator Pera, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm not sure I can comfort you, but your question will keep in our minds in the future, and I hope somebody can give you the answer. But anyway, let me introduce to you Justice Scalia. I suppose I'm not to say any words about him because he's a person so very well known. Let me just thank you for coming, and let me congratulate to you for becoming Senior Justice in the last weeks. Thank you very much for coming, Justice Scalia.
Thank you very much, my friend Giannicola. I don't really much like being introduced as the Senior Associate Justice. I feel like I ought to come in with a cane or something. I am glad that I did not direct my remarks to the philosophy of Filangieri because it would pale into insignificance next to the wonderful lecture you just heard. Anticipating that, I picked a somewhat different topic, relevant to today's discussions, however. So, you know, what do you do after Michelangelo? You become a Renoir, you know, just a totally different style. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon to celebrate the friendship between Filangieri and Benjamin Franklin. And like others, I have to begin by thanking the Library of Congress and Dr. Billington and the Italian Embassy and Ambassador Terzi for working together to shed light on that friendship through a painstaking examination of the correspondence between the two men. And I look forward to hearing about the fruits of that research. I would, of course, celebrate any new insight into the influences on the founders of our country and on the ideas that shaped our Constitution and laws, but it is a particular pleasure to celebrate the influence of an Italian, although I suppose Filangieri would have called himself a Neapolitan. It is a shame that most Americans, even most Americans of Italian origin, and most Americans who are otherwise knowledgeable about the founding era, know little about the Italian influence during that period, which is the subject of my brief remarks today. Of course, many Americans, or at least those who visit Washington, are familiar with the artistic contribution of Italians to the early years of this republic, most evident in the interior of the Capitol building across the street. Constantino Brumidi, a native of Rome and a naturalized American citizen, painted many of the beautiful frescoes that decorate the interior of the Capitol. Everyone's familiar, or ought to be, with the apotheosis of Washington, Brumidi's beautiful fresco covering the dome of the Capitol, and his frieze in the rotunda depicting American history. Indeed, Brumidi's artwork is the centerpiece of public tours of the Capitol today. But Brumidi also adorned the corridors on the Senate side of the Capitol and several committee rooms throughout the building with his frescoes. The beauty of the Capitol was enhanced by other Italians as well, Enrico Calcici. Incidentally, my father was a scholar of Romance languages, and one of the things, he didn't teach me French. He wanted me to learn Italian, which I never did because it was just never taught at the schools that I attended. He wouldn't speak it at home. But one of the things he told me is that there's no such thing as a spelling bee in Italy, because if you say the word, you can spell it. I mean, it's a stupid exercise. And Italians think it's really quite weird, you know, to have a contest about who can spell a word. It's ridiculous. But that's not true about names. So if I mispronounce some of these names, just raise your hand and tell me how to say it right. There is no rule for the pronunciation of Italian names, as I learned when I first went to Italy, sailing on the SS Vulcania, an old Swedish ship that was owned by the Italian lines. And I'm walking up to the officers who are sitting at the table in their white uniforms, and I hand the first Italian officer my passport, and he looks at me and he says, "Ah, Signor Scalia." I was so mad. I thought, for once people would mispronounce Schwartz and Jones and all the Italian, and here he's mispronouncing Scalia. But of course, he wasn't Sicilian, so he has to be forgiven. If he were Sicilian, he would have known it's a common enough Sicilian. Anyway, there are no rules, so forgive me if I get these names wrong. I think it's Calcici. Calcici's 1820s bas-reliefs depicting the landing of the Pilgrims and a conflict between Daniel Boone and a group of Indians sit on top of the east and south entrances to the rotunda. Antonio Capellano contributed a bas-relief of Pocahontas preserving the life of Captain John Smith. I think many of you have seen that. That's over the west entrance to the rotunda. And another relief over the bronze doors on the east portico. Luigi Persico, or perhaps it's Persico. It is Persico. There you are. Whose work adorns many Italian churches and palaces, also contributed several sculptural elements to the Capitol, including the figures of justice, hope, and America occupying the Capitol's central pediment. A less well-known Italian artist preserved the likeness of over 30 framers in stone during the 1790s. The busts of Giuseppe Carracci, a native of the Papal States, are displayed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, George Washington, the New York Public Library, Alexander Hamilton, and across the street at the Supreme Court, John Jay. Jefferson enjoyed Carracci's bust so much that he placed one of himself and one of Alexander Hamilton, his chief political enemy, on opposite sides of the main entrance to Monticello. "Opposed in death as in life," Jefferson remarked. And of course, I could hardly fail to mention the Italian architect whose work is reflected throughout this country, even though he rarely left Italy. I am speaking, of course, of Andrea Palladio, who inspired the neoclassicism reflected in most of the public buildings and even many private residences of the early Republic. Between 1760 and 1820, Palladio was the most celebrated and emulated architect in America. Thomas Jefferson owned Palladio's Quattro Libri dell'Architettura and declared at one point that all of Monticello's neoclassical architectural elements are, quote, "in the truest proportions according to Palladio." He chose Palladio's plans for the Maison Carrée as his inspiration of the Virginia Capitol, and his plans for the Pantheon. They're not really plans, they're his estimations of what it ought to have been. His plans for the Pantheon as his inspiration for the Rotunda at the University of Virginia, which is replicated, by the way, in the Jefferson Memorial on the tidal basin here in Washington. But less well known to Americans than the Italian artists are the Italian thinkers who profoundly influenced the law and politics of the early United States. Filangieri, of course, was one of them. He is best remembered for his La Scienza della Legislazione, the science of legislation, a bold and unfinished work outlining a restructuring of society based on the Enlightenment ideas of liberty and tolerance. That is the work which sparked the correspondence between Filangieri and Franklin that we are celebrating today, and that we will hear more about. As a judge, I am most interested in the third and fourth volumes of Filangieri's work, which focused on making criminal law less barbaric and more rational. They advocated replacing what we would call common law crimes with a clear, precise penal code, and called for universal adoption of the jury trial system, the bulwark against oppressive government, which we enshrined in the Sixth Amendment to our Constitution. And Filangieri's La Scienza denounced disproportionate and cruel punishments, a denunciation echoed in our Eighth Amendment. Filangieri was not the first to put forward these ideas. The Milanese philosopher Cesare Beccaria, among others, had proposed the same ideas almost 20 years earlier. But as the Piemontese jurist Francesco Vasco noted, Filangieri was the first man who had enough courage, patience, and intelligence to write out a complete plan of criminal legislation, implementing the Enlightenment vision of a more rational criminal justice system. We know Franklin praised Filangieri's earlier work and anxiously awaited the penal volumes of La Scienza. But as far as I know, Franklin's opinion of those volumes is lost to history. Perhaps we are here today at the Library of Congress to prove me wrong about that. In any event, Filangieri's influence on Franklin can be seen in Franklin's famous letter to Benjamin Vaughan on the criminal laws and the practice of privateering, which attacked England's most cruel and absurd criminal provisions and agreed with both Beccaria and Filangieri about the misplaced fetishizing of general deterrence in the criminal law. I will say no more about Filangieri. The other speakers today know more about his life and philosophy than I do, and you will hear about it from them. Let me mention, however, some other Italians who helped shape American thought in the founding period. Beccaria, of course, was one. His 1764 Dei delitti e delle pene, about crimes and punishment, was well known throughout the American colonies. In fact, it was arguably the most influential and important book on penal reform during the 18th century. Several editions of his work were published in the United States between 1767 and 1786. During that time, Pennsylvania, Franklin's home, and other colonies moved towards bringing their penal laws into line with Beccaria's philosophy. The number of death-eligible crimes was significantly reduced. Torturous punishments such as branding, ear cropping, and pillorying were replaced with imprisonment at hard labor. Beccaria also appeared in the writings of many prominent Americans. Jefferson transcribed the most important passages of Dei delitti into one of his commonplace books. Robert Turnbull and Benjamin Rush relied on Beccaria's ideas in advocating abolition of the death penalty. Perhaps most famously, John Adams quoted Beccaria to the jury during the pre-revolution trial of the British soldiers who fired upon civilians in the so-called Boston Massacre. He said, quoting Beccaria, "If, by supporting the rights of mankind and of invincible truth, I shall contribute to save from the agonies of death the unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessing and tears of transport will be sufficient compensation to me for the contempt of all mankind." Adams repeated that quote from Beccaria in his diary as a private comfort for the public scorn he received for having defended the British soldiers. While Filangieri and Beccaria may have been well known among the colonial elite, another Italian was well known to a wide swath of colonial America, though he is regrettably known to few Americans, even among the elite today: Pasquale Paoli. Paoli, a Corsican, led that island's successful revolt against Genoan rule in the 1750s. In less than a year, he had confined the Genoese to their citadels on the coast, where they would remain until they sold their citadels to the French years later. And he declared Corsica an independent sovereign nation. None of this would have been especially noteworthy to Americans, except for what happened next. Free of the Genoese, the Corsicans were one of the first people who had an opportunity to create a government fashioned from Enlightenment principles. Not wanting to squander the opportunity, Paoli asked Jean-Jacques Rousseau himself to help design the Corsican Constitution. Rousseau responded in classic French fashion, I might remark, with a lengthy philosophical essay. Filangieri, I suspect, would actually have been helpful by providing concrete proposals. Corsica subsequently adopted a Republican constitution authored by Paoli, who became the Republic's first president. Corsica thus proved that a post-Enlightenment Republican government was possible. Corsica and Paoli resonated with the American colonists for a second reason. At the same time that the colonists were resisting the Sugar and Stamp Acts, the Corsicans were resisting French attempts to colonize the island. The British, while attempting to suppress the colonies, were, as one commentator said, only too happy to supply the Corsicans in their Paoli-led battle against the French. The parallels between Paoli and the colonists and the hypocritical stance of the British towards the two situations were not lost on Benjamin Franklin. In 1769, he tweaked London for its hypocrisy through a pseudonymous letter purportedly penned by a Frenchman, which went, "You English consider us French as enemies to liberty. You reproach us for endeavoring to reduce Corsica to our obedience. The Corsicans are not as remote from us as the Americans are from you. They never enriched us by their labor and their commerce. They never engaged in our wars and fought as our brothers, side by side with us and for us, bleeding in the same cause. They never loved and honored us. They are not our children. Yet at this very moment, while you are abusing us for attempting to reduce the Corsicans, you yourselves are about to make slaves of a much greater number of those British Americans." Both Franklin and France also used Britain's support of Paoli to justify France's intervention into the American Revolution. The parallels were not lost on other American colonists either. The Boston Sons of Liberty, a band of patriots, some would say rabble-rousers, headed by Samuel Adams, repeatedly toasted, quote, "the illustrious Paoli and the brave Corsicans." The Philadelphia Sons of Liberty celebrated Paoli's birthday in 1769 by wishing the spirit of Paoli to every American. Colonial radicals widely regarded Paoli's resistance against the Genoese and then the French and American resistance to the Stamp Act as two episodes in the same worldwide struggle between liberty and despotism. And Paoli's successes gave them hope that their own struggle against British despotism would be successful. Although the zest for Paoli waned after France conquered Corsica in 1770, he still lingered in the American consciousness. To date, no less than 5 American towns bear his name, mispronounced. Paoli, Pennsylvania, Paoli, Colorado, Paoli, Indiana, Paoli, Oklahoma, and Paoli, Wisconsin. And finally, I must mention Filippo Mazzei, who had a more direct influence on the founders. He occupies a special place in my affection since my father, a professor of Romance languages, translated his letters into English. A native of Tuscany, Mazzei moved to London in the 1750s and met Franklin while purchasing 2 stoves for the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1767. Franklin introduced Mazzei to London's American community, and within a few years, his immersion in that community convinced him to immigrate to the colonies. He arrived in 1773, intending to introduce the cultivation of Tuscan olives and grapes to America, and he purchased a farm next to Jefferson's Monticello. He soon found Virginia politics more interesting than his vineyards, however, and counted among his friends the leading figures in colonial Virginia: Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Patrick Henry, among others. Jefferson would translate Mazzei's fervent political tracts into English for publication under the pseudonym Furioso. A line from one of them had particular resonance with Jefferson. It stated, quote, "All men are by nature equally free and independent. Jefferson included the line verbatim in the 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights, on which our Bill of Rights was modeled. And he modified it only slightly when writing the most stirring words of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson's 40-year friendship with Mazzei produced a domestic political controversy during John Adams' presidency. In a private letter to Mazzei, Jefferson accused George Washington's administration of seeking to revert to an aristocratic British style of governments. And he said that some members of that administration who had been, quote, Samsons in the field, close quote, had, quote, had their heads shorn by the harlot England, close quote. Mazzei had the letter published in an Italian newspaper, which inevitably led to the letter's publication in America. It was a political disaster for Jefferson, who was then Vice President of the United States, comparing George Washington, who had voluntarily retired from the presidency only recently, and who retained a halo of perfection in most Americans' eyes, to a fallen biblical figure, did not go over well with the American people or with Jefferson's political enemies. Well, I will stop there. It is regrettable that the Italian influence on America, particularly on the beliefs of our nation's founders, is little known. Our school children think that the only significant European influences were Montesquieu and Lafayette. At least as far as Filangieri is concerned, this collaboration between the Italian Embassy and the Library of Congress will help to remedy that defect. My congratulations once again on this wonderful project, whose product I look forward to seeing. Thank you.
And now we have time to speak about the research we have conducted in cooperation with the Library of Congress. I would like starting to say many thanks to the European Division. Mr. Georgette Dorn is here to be so pleased to accept the works of my intern in the library. Let me thanks also to the rare book section, Dan De Simone, that's realized the collection that you can see in the next room, and all the people of the Library of Congress that cooperate with us in this research. When we start a few months ago, it happened that I was informed that a new intern was sent from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Embassy of Italy in Washington. When I read the curricula of this intern, and I read it was a PhD candidate in history, I suppose it was a mistake of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because I cannot realize which was the reason why a PhD candidate in history could be an intern at the Embassy of Italy in Washington, in a diplomatic institution. So it was in my mind Apollo 13, how we can transform this bureaucratic disaster in a great success. I have in my mind the idea to realize a research on the relationship between Gaetano Filangieri and Benjamin Franklin, and I suppose that was the right occasion to start. And we started. We had this wonderful cooperation with the Library of Congress, and Miss Monica D'Agostini, she's here with us, collect all the correspondence between Filangieri and Franklin that for the first time you will find in our research. 20 letters, 2 letters from Franklin to Filangieri, and 6 letters from Filangieri to Franklin, and the others of people that intermediate this relation. Was a huge history of a network of masonry of the time. You can imagine, because the only network in Europe we had. But these people, like Isidoro Bianchi, a priest who also a Freemason, but also Luigi Pio, that was a diplomat sent to Paris from the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. He met in Paris as ambassador of the American states, Franklin, and started this cooperation because Franklin was hosted for a dinner from Luigi Pio in Paris. He had a look at the library of Luigi Pio and found 2 volumes of the not very well-known and young philosopher as Gaetano Filangieri. He asked to Luigi Pio if it would be possible to take a look of these 2 books, and he was so impressed of the job that Gaetano Filangieri did that decided to open a correspondence with Gaetano Filangieri. So, in this way started the history in the 1780, and I would like to introduce to you Monica D'Agostini. She will be able to explain how we collect all the letters, all the correspondences between the 2 great of the 17th century. Monica.
Thank you. The history of the letters, the documents, and the book exchange between Gaetano Filangieri and Benjamin Franklin from 1781 and 1787 is a fascinating and complicated tale. The relationship between these 2 philosophers and thinkers was born and grown up in the shadow of the Ancien Régime, feeded and feeding the laboratory of enlightenment, of the revolution, and of Freemasonry. Their correspondence is a significant proof of the exchange of new ideas in the European intellectual world, although the obstacles imposed by governments which were trying in every way to fight the intellectual flowering of the Enlightenment, of the Revolution, and of Freemasonry. Of the original letters, we only have 6 letters of Filangieri left and conserved in Philadelphia, and only 1 of Franklin's letters preserved in Naples. We still have a photo of the 2nd letters of Franklin and a mention of the 3rd one's contents in an answer of Franklin. We also have some important evidence concerning this relation in some letters written to Filangieri and Franklin by Luigi Pio, the Neapolitan delegate in Paris, and trade union between Filangieri and Franklin. In the end, we have a letter of Filangieri's wife to Franklin. In addition, other proofs of the relation are the translations in Italian of Franklin's letters to Filangieri and the US Constitution commissioned from Filangieri because he didn't know English and conserved in Naples in Filangieri's museum. Nowadays, we can see all the letters exchanged between Filangieri and Franklin between 1781 and 1783. From what we have read and examined in our research, we can observe the clear mutual interest of the 2 thinkers. It's evident the admiration that Filangieri has for the well-known statesman and philosopher Benjamin Franklin. The American statesman seems to become the first addressee of the science of legislation, so that Filangieri constantly asked him for opinions and advices. Besides, it's clear that in Filangieri's opinion, Pennsylvania is the place where his science of legislation should be first addressed, because it was the country which would be the pioneer for a new age, the age where the new world would bring the old one. This was more or less a salvific project, which involved the whole West world. The efficient cause would be Benjamin Franklin and Pennsylvania, and Filangieri wants to be an active part in this project. This is the motivation of Filangieri's desire to go to America, this golden land for the 2 thinkers of the Enlightenment. We also have noticed that the written answer sent by Franklin to Filangieri in 1783 is not only a courtesy, particularly considering that in those years political activity completely absorbed Franklin's energies. The American statesman had showed clear interest for Filangieri's work, and he asked many copies of the Science of Legislation, and he devoted himself in spreading it out through friends and acquaintances. He clearly appreciated Filangieri's ideas, and he pushed the philosopher not to give up to his project, but to go on with his work. Franklin revealed himself the addressee and the interlocutor that Filangieri hoped he would be. The most amazing thing is probably that Franklin's expectations about the third and the fourth volumes of the Science of Legislation, because they are related to a delicate and crucial aspect for the American statesman. He, in fact, seems to be intentioned to use Filangieri's work as base for the criminal legislation of Pennsylvania. Besides, Franklin sent to Filangieri both a political essay and the Constitution des 13 États-Unis de l'Amérique. And this clearly shows the esteem the American had for the Neapolitan philosopher. In the end, we also have to consider that Franklin really valued Filangieri's desire to move to the United States, and he proposed a way to realize it, estimating also the advantages of the new world could get from this. On the other hand, from 84 to 87, we start finding some lacks in the correspondence we had received. The meaning of the letters sometimes is hard to understand because we don't have the complete chronological order. In addition, reading the letters, we noticed a general cooling of the relation. Filangieri retired into a private and isolated life and didn't have any more enthusiasm of the years before. Franklin, on the other hand, in 1785 went back to the United States, and he didn't have so much time to go on with the intercontinental correspondence. Considering this, it's much more important that Franklin wrote to Filangieri a few days after the approbation of the US Constitution to send him a copy of the new document. This last letter is the only one preserved in the original version, and we have also the Italian translation. Of these letters, we have the draft preserved here in the LOC. On this occasion, Franklin asked many other copies of some volumes of his work, The Science of Legislation, and he wants to give them to his friend in Philadelphia. Sadly, it's now lost, the US Constitution sent to Filangieri, but we still have the Italian translation. The Neapolitan philosopher received the letter and the Constitution the first day the illness that killed him. Charlotte Frandl, his wife, understood the importance of Filangieri's relationship with Franklin, the intercontinental and international meaning that this friendship was giving to her husband's work. So she decides on September 27, 1788, to answer Franklin and to send him the copies he requested. In the end, the relation between Franklin and Filangieri and the influence that the ideas of one could have had on the other one's way of thinking is still far from being resolved. In our research, we collected, in a logical and chronological order, for the first time, all the letters and all the evidence discovered until now in the world. Reading and analyzing them, we can surely say that this friendship was motivated by a political interest more than an intellectual one. As we can observe from the kind of documents they exchange and the arguments we can find in the letters. A work correspondence that to the idealistic Filangieri could seem to be useful to expand his horizon and to escape from his intellectual prison in Naples. Besides, for the concrete statesman, Franklin, this relation should be useful to reach a political aim, now not anymore identifiable. We keep waiting for history to give us back that missing pieces of this puzzle in order to give more light to the great work of philosophers and thinkers of that age. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So I hope you enjoy this first part of the research that was more historical. Second part is more philological, and it's a huge risk because we started to try also to find some evidence and clues about the influence of this correspondence on the US Constitution. I would like to tell you immediately that I will not speak to you about conclusion. I found evidences, I found clues about this influence, but I want you to take to the conclusion. And I want you also to read the conclusion that we have written in our research, because we are going to publish this research. What you can see on the display is the letter that Luigi Pio sent to Filangieri, informing that Franklin appreciated his job and was committed, or requested to Filangieri information and cooperation for the reform of the penal code in Pennsylvania. So this is the first clue that we have. A letter of a diplomat sent to Filangieri informing him, the express words are, have a good ink to write the code, the penal code for Pennsylvania, because you have to be useful for a new nation. This is the starting, was 1781. But if you go further, you can see another clue there was, this is the science of legislation. But we found this book in the library of Franklin. And the letter V you can find was a letter that was wrote personally with the hand of Franklin. Because this book, The Science of Legislation, probably was the one that Luigi Pio gave to Franklin. And he brought from Paris to Philadelphia, and you can find it in the American Philosophical Society. We found 10 marks and underlines on this book. You can check these underlines. This is the pen of Franklin. And there's also a clear evidence of the interest that Franklin had in the work and the writings of Filangieri. There is another clear evidence. This is a letter of Filangieri to Franklin. It was written on October 27, 1783, thanking for the gift of the Constitution of the 13 states. So, in 1783, this incredible book, because it's a wonderful story, the Congress of the 13 states decided to publish the Constitution of the 13 states in order to share the information of the development of the independence of this country to all the kings and the ambassadors in Europe. And they published the Constitution of the 13 states in 500 copies, giving these copies to Franklin in order to share, to present as a gift to all the ambassadors and kings in Europe, this book, the Constitution of the 13 states. But Franklin asked expressly to Luigi Pio to send a copy of the Constitution of the 13 states to Filangieri in order to have his opinion. Why? That's the question. Why? Franklin asked to Filangieri to have an opinion, comments about the Constitution of the 13 states. I would like to draw your attention about the period. We are between 1783 and 1788. What's happening in the next? There's a letter from Filangieri to Franklin. It's very interesting, in 1784, and it is absolutely new also for Senator Pera, because he asked me to give to you more detailed evidence. In this letter, it's a very incredible letter, because nobody pay attention to what is written in. Filangieri sent to Franklin a page of the volume 3rd, a page that was possible to clearly understand because there is a letter V on this page. And he asked also to have this page back because he has to modify the volumes he had. Which kind of page is this one? I tried to understand to what is related this page. In my opinion, the only volume 3 that we have is the volume 3 of the Science of Legislation. Is exactly the volume that Franklin has to Filangieri to write to support the reform of the penal code in Pennsylvania. And so let me know, I was curious to know which kind of page could be. Letter V could be not a letter, but a number, 5th, as in Roman. And the cape, the title, 5th, of the volume 3, speak exactly about the reform of the inquisitorial procedure. Let me tell you just the last words of this page. It is probably exactly the page that was mentioned in the letter. You must remember that I'm speaking about 1784, and the last words were, the first step in a criminal prosecution should be the intimation to the accused in union with the security of himself. Let me tell you something about, I'm sorry, Justice Scalia, the Sixth Amendment. I know I'm entitled in front of you to speak about the Sixth Amendment, but you will find the Sixth Amendment in 1791 the right to be informed on the nature of the cause of the accusation. There is a clear clue of the correspondences of what was in the letter of Filangieri and Franklin and what is in the Constitution. You can tell me that the amendments are in 1791. 1791 is 1 year after the death of Franklin and 3 years after the death of Filangieri. But in the last letter, the letter of 1787 that Franklin sent to Filangieri, where he sent 27 days after the signing of the US Constitution, a copy of the US Constitution to Filangieri, he also has 9 copies of each volume of the Science of Legislation. Who were the people Franklin was thinking about to give these 9 copies? Are we allowed to think that there were other founding fathers playing their role, their constitutional role in that period? This is the question, no conclusion, as I thought, just evidences and clues. So we tried to find this book, because you can imagine what does it mean to find the Constitution of the 13 states. We were not able to do that. The injury of the time, like in 1799, there was a revolution in Naples, and the building, the house of Filangieri was burned. But we have also another particular situation in the history in 1943, where the German soldiers burned all the documents of the archives, in Naples, where all were conserved in custody, some documents of Filangieri and Franklin. But Bigelow, the famous historian, diplomat, politician, in 1873, wrote a book, who was also ambassador in Paris as Franklin. And he spoke with the grandson of Gaetano Filangieri. His name is also Gaetano Filangieri, the founder of the museum in Naples, and asking about the Constitution of the 13 states. And the Constitution of the 13 states were for sure in the library of Filangieri, because a public notary in 1788, 1 month after the death of Filangieri, makes the inventory. And in the inventory, you will find, as a documented history, the presence of the Constitution of the 13 states. And Bigelow says, I spoke with the grandson of Gaetano Filangieri. He's also named Gaetano Filangieri. And he knew that there was a book named The Constitution of the 13 States that Franklin gave to Gaetano Filangieri, asking his opinion and his comments. And this book was sent back to Franklin. Franklin made these comments on this book, and this book went back to the library of Filangieri. But unfortunately, we were not able to find any more this book. So we tried to find this book. We were not able until now to find this book. But there are two other places we have to search. One place is the place where Gaetano Filangieri lived in the last period of his life. There's a beautiful villa in Cava dei Terreni. Unfortunately, there is a legal dispute. We were not able to go in order to check if there is a library, if there is the Constitution of the 13 states. And there is also another clue that we have. That is, everybody check the male descendants of Gaetano Filangieri. We check also the female descendants. And we found there was also the granddaughter, not only the grandson, whose name was Teresa. And she has also a beautiful villa, but in Rocca, Piemonte. I don't want to bother you with my conversation, annoying you with my conversation about all the descendants of Filangieri. But anyway, we found also this other place where it's possible to find a library of the 18th and 19th century. And we are going to check also this library. So this is a very beautiful story. A beautiful story of juridical relationship. It's a beautiful story of political relationship. For sure, Franklin appreciated the work that Filangieri did in this very short life. And we are pretty sure that if Franklin started a relationship with Filangieri, sending a constitution before the Federation of the United States, and send a copy of the Constitution a few days after, the relationship should be inside the development of the Constitution in this country in this period, because in the opposite, it has no sense. It has no sense at all. So let me go concluding my presentation. We will continue our search. We had obstacles, juridical, legal, also the injury of the story of the history, as I told you, but we will continue this story. It's not an issue for a judge like me, probably it's an issue for an historian like Monica, who is also younger than me. She can conduct this investigation that we have to continue. But I'm quite sure that it is a wonderful story, and I'm confident I was able to have your interest, your attention on this story. And I hope, really hope, to join your effort. I know that there are so many Italian-American lawyers, many scholars, jurists in this room, that you will keep the same interest we had in this history to continue this historical research, to continue this philological research, and to continue to support the relationship between Italy and the United States. Thank you to everybody. And if you have time, thank you once more to the Library of Congress and the Rare Book section, because you can have a look on the exhibition of the maps of the time. There is two wonderful maps, one of Italy in 1760 and one of the United States in 1783, and also many copies of rare books like The Science of Legislation. Let me just draw your attention on one information about the books you can find in the other room. In a few years, we had the translation of the Science of Legislation in different languages, in French and in English, just a few years after. If 8 volumes of these wonderful works of Filangieri was translated in different language, just in a few years after the publication, that means there was an interest not only for Naples, but for an interest for all humankind, all the known world at the time. Thank you very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.